Hi guys, I'm Lily. I'm from the Chapter 9 and 10 group. I'm going to be talking about Chapter 9, mostly about Darwin and Wallace and the similarities and differences. So Chapter 9 talks about naturalists of the Victorian era, again mostly Darwin and Wallace, who both made large contributions to evolutionary thought and the theory of natural selection. Darwin and Wallace had their similarities and differences, but before going into that, I want to briefly discuss another naturalist, Robert Chambers. So Robert Chambers was the secret author of Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, which was published in 1844. This was the only evolution book readers in the English-speaking world were familiar with during the Victorian era. In it, Chambers suggests that everything currently in existence has developed from earlier forms, and that man was an advanced evolutionary step that could be traced backwards through the rest of the lower animals. So this is kind of where evolutionary thought began. The public supported his book because he talked about the coexistence of God and nature, and scientists criticized the book due to Chambers' limited scientific experience and just the lack of explanation and so forth. So Darwin and Wallace both read Vestiges. Darwin had his critiques, but overall, he saw the book as good for the country because it called to attention the subject of evolution. And through some of Wallace's work, one can also see the impact Vestiges had on his thinking. So many of us know Charles Darwin for his evolutionary theory and famous book of The Origins of Species, published in 1850. But who was Wallace? Alfred Russel Wallace was a naturalist, biologist, very known scholar, in the same period as Darwin, who independently came up with the idea of natural selection. And as Ramachandra points out, he was equally as important as Darwin in this process. Natural selection states that the development of life from non-life is purely naturalistic. So just a brief summary here. As random genetic mutations occur within an organism's genetic code, the beneficial mutations are preserved because they aid survival, natural selection. So beneficial mutations are passed on to the next generation, and over time beneficial mutations accumulate, resulting in an entirely different organism. So both Darwin and Wallace wrote a joint paper on evolution by natural selection in 1850, so that just goes to prove how similar they were in that. As for the differences, Darwin believed that natural selection could explain our talents in music, art, math, and other intellectual abilities, and Wallace disagreed and believed that these human abilities were not due to pure chance. Wallace argued that natural selection could not explain man completely, and therefore some higher intelligence must have directed the process by which human nature was developed. Wallace was a spiritualist, and he believed that there were limits to natural selection when applied to man, and Darwin disagreed because he did not believe in any supreme being intervening with the world. So after all those years, we're still having the same debate, of course. Can everything be explained by evolution? Is there an intelligent designer? Does God exist? And where in the brain does he exist, as Chapter 9 tries to tackle down this question? When it comes to human beings, we know that there are many different answers and thoughts to these questions. Many debates, of course. Some say that our consciousness and self does not exist. Others believe that the consciousness and the self are illusions. In Ramachandran, there's a quote by Darwin where he asks, why is thought being a secretion of the brain more wonderful than gravity, property of matter? So given today's technology, scientists are trying to answer that question. Where do thoughts come from? The human consciousness is such a twilight zone, and many people just speculate about it, what it is, where in the brain does it exist. A philosopher on the mind, Alan Wallace, I like this quote by him, states that despite centuries of modern philosophical and scientific research, into the nature of the mind. At present, there is no technology that can detect the presence or absence of any kind of consciousness, for scientists do not even know what exactly is to be measured. At present, there is no scientific evidence even of the existence of consciousness, because all the direct evidence we have consists of non-scientific first-person account of being conscious. So Virginia Woolf, a writer in the 20th century who wrote about the mind and the self, has also said that consciousness is a process and not a place. So I think that we need to realize that not everything in our brain can be scientifically studied. We also need to look at multiple viewpoints, since both people who believe in God and those who do not use science as a way to explain the self and the consciousness and everything else. So this chapter, of course, chapter 9, can spark a lot of debate, but again, neuroscience can only go so far in explaining things like God and the self. So maybe we'll never know, for if we did, what would we do then? I just think it's important to also realize that this book was written in 1987, and there is a lot of new research out there, but again, many things still remain a mystery.